No one wants you here. Those were the words that hit me first sharp and clean like a blade slid between my ribs without warning. I didn't hear the music anymore. I didn't see the champagne glasses lifted toward midnight. All I could see was my older sister's mouth finishing the sentence, the corners of her lips lifting just slightly, as if she'd finally said something she'd rehearsed for years. If you had asked me an hour earlier, I would have told you this night was supposed to be different. It was my cousin's winter wedding held in a renovated mansion just outside Savannah, all white columns and crystal chandeliers. The kind of place my mother loved because it looked like money even if it didn't belong to us. I'd spent weeks deciding whether to come. My gut had told me not to. It always did when family gatherings were involved. But I went anyway because some part of me still believed showing up mattered. I was wrong. I stood there in my navy silk dress, one hand wrapped around a glass of sparkling cider I hadn't touched. The countdown clock above the bandstand glowed red, ticking down toward midnight. Guests clustered together, arms linked, laughter spilling over itself. And there I was, standing 3 feet from my own blood, suddenly treated like a stain someone had just noticed on a white tablecloth. My sister Claire leaned closer. "You're embarrassing everyone," she said quietly. "Mom agrees." I turned my head just enough to see our mother nod, once slow and deliberate. No hesitation, no confusion, just confirmation. That nod hurt more than the words. For a second, I truly thought someone would laugh, that someone would step in and say Claire was being dramatic, that this was just stress or champagne talking. But the silence around us thickened instead. People at the table avoided my eyes. My aunt suddenly found her napkin fascinating. My uncle cleared his throat and looked toward the stage like he'd just remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere. I felt myself shrinking, that familiar sensation I'd carried since childhood, like my body knew this role by heart. The forgotten one, the extra. The bandleader raised his microphone, oblivious. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we approach midnight, we'd like to recognize a very special guest tonight." Claire smirked. I knew that look. It was the same one she'd worn when she'd gotten the bigger bedroom, the better school, the car I'd been promised and then told I didn't really need. My chest tightened. I wanted to leave. I wanted to vanish, but my feet wouldn't move. "Tonight," the man continued, "we celebrate someone who's built something extraordinary from nothing. A woman whose work has quietly changed more lives than most people in this room will ever know." I frowned, confused now. This wasn't part of the wedding program. The man glanced down at his card. "Please join me in recognizing Miss Hannah Cole." For a heartbeat, the room didn't react at all. It was like the air itself had stalled. That was my name. I felt every head turn. I felt the weight of 100 strangers suddenly noticing me, really noticing me for the first time that night. My mother's mouth fell open. Claire's smile froze, then cracked. What she whispered, I didn't move. I couldn't. My pulse roared in my ears. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks began to pop, muffled through the thick winter air. "Hannah Cole," the man repeated louder now. Founder and chief strategist of a consulting firm that recently finalized a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. The room erupted. Applause rolled across the marble floor, hesitant at first, then swelling. People stood. Cameras flashed. Someone behind me said my name like it was a secret they wished they'd known sooner. My glass slipped from my fingers and shattered at my feet. I didn't feel it. I looked at my mother. Her face had gone pale, the careful confidence she wore like perfume evaporating in seconds. Claire stared at me like I'd just confessed to a crime. "You lied," Claire hissed. "You never told us." I finally found my voice. It came out calm, steadier than I felt. "You never asked." The band struck up again, louder this time, but I barely heard it. I set my empty hand on the table to ground myself, feeling the cool marble beneath my palm. Years collapsed into that moment. Every Christmas when my gifts were practical and Claire's were extravagant. Every Thanksgiving when something went wrong and my name somehow ended up attached to it. Every birthday forgotten or postponed because someone else needed the attention more. I'd learned early that in our family, silence was survival. Success, I'd learned later, was something you kept to yourself until it was strong enough that no one could take it from you. The man on stage gestured toward me, inviting me forward. The applause grew louder. People I'd never met reached out as I passed hands, brushing my arm, voices congratulating me like we were old friends. I walked past my mother without stopping. She grabbed my wrist, her nails biting into my skin. Hannah, she whispered urgently, her voice shaking. We need to talk. I gently pulled free. Not tonight. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You don't get to do this, she snapped. You don't get to humiliate us like this. I turned back to her then, really looked at her. The perfect hair, the borrowed confidence, the entitlement she'd worn like armor our entire lives. I didn't humiliate you, I said quietly. I survived you. That shut her up. As I stepped onto the stage, the spotlight washed over me, warm and blinding. The man handed me the microphone. My hands trembled, but I held it steady. I wasn't planning to speak, I said, my voice carrying easily in the stunned silence. But since I've already been reminded tonight where I stand with my family, I suppose it's only fair to say this. I paused, letting the room breathe with me. Sometimes the people who tell you that you don't belong are the very reason you learn how to build a life that no one can take away. Applause thundered. From the stage, I could see my mother sink back into her chair. I could see Claire staring at the floor, her face flushed with something that looked a lot like fear. As the clock struck midnight and the crowd erupted again, I realized something fundamental had shifted. They had erased me for years. Tonight the world had written me back in. And they had no idea what that meant yet. I left the mansion before the applause fully faded. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because staying felt dangerous. Success has a way of making people remember you exist. And I wasn't ready to let my family rewrite history just because the room had changed its mind about me. Outside, the night air was damp and cool, heavy with the smell of winter jasmine. Fireworks cracked overhead, bright and violent against the dark Georgia sky. Couples spilled onto the stone steps, laughing, kissing clinking glasses. I stood alone at the edge of the driveway, my heels sinking slightly into gravel, my hands shaking now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. I told myself to breathe. This wasn't victory yet, it was exposure. And exposure, I'd learned, always came with consequences. My phone buzzed, then buzzed again. I didn't need to look to know who it was. When I finally glanced down, the screen was a wall of missed calls and messages. My mother, Claire, an aunt who hadn't remembered my birthday in 10 years, a cousin who once asked me at Thanksgiving whether I was still doing that little job. I turned the phone face down. As the driver opened the door of the car arranged by the event coordinator, a memory rose uninvited, sharp as a paper cut. I was 10 years old again, standing in the kitchen of our childhood home, my socks damp from a leaky faucet, watching my mother frost a cake. It wasn't my birthday. It was Claire's. The cake was tall and elaborate layers, smooth and perfect. I remember asking quietly if I could help. My mother hadn't even looked at me when she said no. You'll mess it up. That sentence followed me through life like a curse. I slid into the back seat and closed the door, the glass muting the distant noise. As the car pulled away, the mansion shrank behind us, its glowing windows blurring into something unreal. People like to believe favoritism is subtle, that it's about personality clashes or misunderstandings, but in my family it was procedural, organized, almost elegant in its cruelty. Claire was 3 years older. She was beautiful in the way that earned forgiveness before mistakes were even made. Teachers adored her. Relatives praised her confidence. My parents built their future plans around her like she was the only investment that mattered. I was the other one. At Thanksgiving, if something burned, it was because I distracted someone. If a guest felt uncomfortable, it was because I was too quiet. If Claire snapped at me, I was told not to provoke her. I learned early that speaking up only made things worse. Silence became my shield, observation my skill. By 16, I was invisible by design. I worked after school, saved money, quietly kept my grades high without celebration. When college acceptance letters came, Claire's were framed. Mine were tucked into a drawer. You're so independent, my mother liked to say. It sounded like praise. It wasn't. It was permission to neglect me. The car merged onto the highway, city lights stretching ahead like a promise I wasn't sure I deserved yet. My driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, smiling politely, clearly impressed by the event. Big night for you, he said. I nodded. Yes, bigger than they know. He laughed softly, not understanding the weight of it. Back at my hotel, I kicked off my shoes and stood barefoot on the carpet, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed unfamiliar. She looked composed, powerful, like someone who had always known where she was going. I pressed my palm against the glass. "Don't forget," I whispered. "They taught you how to disappear. You taught yourself how to endure." My phone buzzed again. This time I answered. "Hannah." My mother said immediately, her voice trembling with something that sounded suspiciously like panic. "Why didn't you tell us?" I sat on the edge of the bed. "Tell you what?" "That you were—" "All of this," she said. "We could have helped." I almost laughed. "You did help," I said, "by leaving me alone." There was a pause. I could picture her face the way she always looked when she was recalculating. "Claire is very upset," she said finally. "I'm sure," I replied. "She usually is when the world doesn't cooperate." "Hannah," my mother warned, slipping into the tone she used when she wanted obedience. "Family doesn't embarrass each other like that." The old instinct flared, the urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to make myself smaller so others could breathe easier. I ignored it. "Family doesn't erase each other either," I said. "And yet here we are." She inhaled sharply. "You're being dramatic." "No," I said. "I'm being honest. There's a difference." I ended the call before she could respond. My hands were steady this time. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, letting memories wash through me without fighting them. The forgotten birthdays. The excuses. The way Claire once told me casually that Mom trusted her more because she was more important to the family image. That night at the gala hadn't created the rift, it had exposed it. And exposure has a way of attracting attention. By morning, my inbox was full. Messages from industry contacts congratulating me, invitations to speak, requests for interviews. Somewhere between the emails, a single message from an unfamiliar address caught my eye. I shouldn't have opened it, but curiosity has always been my weakness. The subject line read, "You don't know the whole story." My stomach tightened as I clicked. The message was brief, no greeting, no signature, just a single sentence. "Your parents made a choice years ago, and it wasn't just about favoritism." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Whatever I thought I knew about my family, I had the sudden sinking feeling that it was only the surface. And if they had hidden something this long, then my disappearance had never been accidental. I read the message again, slower this time. "Your parents made a choice years ago, and it wasn't just about favoritism." The words sat there heavy and deliberate, not cruel, not taunting, just factual. That scared me more than insults ever had. I checked the sender's address, a generic email, no name, no signature. Whoever it was didn't want to be found, only heard. For a long time, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the phone in my hand, the morning light creeping through the curtains. Outside, Savannah was waking up. Horse-drawn carriages rattled past. Tourists laughed blissfully, unaware that my entire understanding of my childhood was starting to fracture. I told myself it was probably nothing. A jealous relative, a stranger looking to stir drama after last night's announcement. That would have been easier. But my gut knew better. There were too many moments growing up that had never quite made sense. Too many silences. Too many looks exchanged over my head. Too many decisions that always landed on me being the one who had to sacrifice. I typed back before I could overthink it. "What choice?" The response came almost immediately. "Meet me, today, if you really want answers." An address followed. A small law office on the edge of town. My pulse quickened. Lawyers were never involved in family stories unless money, guilt, or both were buried underneath. I showered, dressed simply, and left the hotel without telling anyone where I was going. Old habits die hard. The office was tucked between a closed-down bakery and a tax service, its sign faded by years of sun. Inside, the air smelled like dust and paper. A woman at the front desk looked up, startled, then nodded as if she'd been expecting me. "She's waiting," she said, gesturing toward a door at the end of the hall. I stepped inside and froze. The woman standing behind the desk was in her late 60s, silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her posture straight, but weary. She studied me carefully as if comparing me to a memory. "You look just like her," she said softly. "Like who?" I asked, my voice tight. She gestured for me to sit. "My name is Eleanor Price. I was your grandmother's attorney." My chest constricted. My grandmother died before I was born. "Yes," Eleanor said, "and that's where the story starts." She folded her hands on the desk. "Your grandmother, Ruth Cole, was not the sweet, frail woman your parents described. She was sharp, strategic, and very, very disappointed in her children." I swallowed. My parents rarely spoke about her. When they did, it was with a kind of defensive reverence, like they were trying to convince themselves she'd loved them. "She left a will," Eleanor continued. Not just a simple one, a layered one, with conditions. I leaned forward. What kind of conditions? Eleanor reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. She believed favoritism destroyed families. She saw it in her own life. So she decided to test something. My hands trembled as she slid a document across the desk. She left the bulk of her estate in a trust, Eleanor said. But it was not assigned to your parents. It was assigned to you. The room tilted. That's impossible, I said. They told me there was nothing left. That she died broke. Eleanor smiled sadly. They told you that because the trust only activated under specific conditions. Conditions they were supposed to meet. I stared at the document, my name typed cleanly at the top. What conditions? I whispered. They had to treat you equally, Eleanor said. Not perfectly, just fairly. Birthdays, education, opportunity. No documented favoritism. My throat burned, and if they didn't, Eleanor's gaze sharpened. Then they forfeited everything. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Every memory rushed back at once. The college fund that never existed. The gifts that always fell short. The way Claire was positioned as the future while I was positioned as expendable. They failed, didn't they? I said. Yes, Eleanor replied, spectacularly. I laughed then. A short, broken sound. So where is it, the trust? Eleanor hesitated. It didn't activate when you were younger. You didn't know to claim it. And your parents assumed you never would. My pulse pounded. Assumed wrong. Eleanor nodded. However, there's a complication. Of course there was. They filed legal objections years ago, she continued. Claimed you were too unstable, too detached, that you wouldn't manage it responsibly. I felt anger bloom hot and sharp. They erased me and then used my erasure as evidence. Yes, Eleanor said quietly, which is why I reached out now. She leaned forward. Your public success changes everything. Their narrative doesn't hold anymore. I thought of my mother's nod at the wedding. Claire's smug certainty. They hadn't just favored her. They had been racing against a clock trying to outgrow the consequences of their own behavior. What happens next? I asked. Eleanor slid another paper toward me. You challenge the objections. You force the trust to be reviewed. And them? I asked. Eleanor met my eyes. They will have to explain under oath every decision they made. A slow calm settled over me. This wasn't revenge yet. It was reckoning. I stood to leave the weight of generations pressing on my shoulders, but for the first time, it didn't feel crushing. It felt clarifying. At the door, Eleanor stopped me. Your grandmother believed something very strongly, she said. That truth doesn't always protect the innocent immediately, but it always surfaces eventually. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding. I took a deep breath, my phone buzzing again in my pocket. Another message from my mother, another demand, another attempt to control the story. I didn't answer. For the first time, I understood the full scope of what they'd done. And for the first time, I knew exactly how to take it all back. I didn't go back to the hotel after leaving Eleanor's office. I walked, miles of it, down streets where tourists posed under hanging moss past cafes, where couples lingered over late lunches through neighborhoods where nobody knew my name or my history. My phone buzzed constantly in my coat pocket, but I ignored it. I needed the silence. Because once you realize your life wasn't just unfair, but deliberately engineered that way, the anger hits differently. It's no longer a vague ache, it becomes sharp, focused. By the time I finally sat on a bench near the river, my hands were steady. That scared me a little. Calm like that usually meant I'd crossed a line internally. There was no going back to hoping things would somehow soften on their own. I called Eleanor back before sunset. I want everything I told her, every document, every objection, every note they ever filed. She didn't hesitate. I was hoping you'd say that. The next week blurred into a rhythm that felt strangely familiar. Research, late nights, coffee gone cold beside stacks of paperwork. It reminded me of how I'd built my career quietly, methodically, while my family assumed I was drifting. Eleanor's assistant scanned and emailed files in batches. Court filings, trust amendments, letters my parents had written years ago arguing why I should never control money, never be trusted with autonomy. Reading them felt like watching strangers dissect my personality, using pieces they'd broken off themselves. She lacks ambition. She prefers isolation. She has difficulty maintaining close relationships. I laughed out loud at that last one. Of course I did. I'd learned early that closeness was conditional. The most damning document wasn't even legal. It was a letter my mother had written to Eleanor marked confidential, dated when I was 19. Hannah is capable, yes, but she doesn't need more encouragement. Claire needs structure and support to thrive. Hannah will manage regardless. There it was, the justification I'd lived under my entire life, written plainly without shame. I forwarded everything to my attorney in New York, a woman named Marissa, who specialized in trust disputes and didn't waste time on sympathy. They buried themselves, she said after reviewing the files. We just have to let them talk. How long, I asked. Long enough for them to panic, she replied. The first official notice went out 3 days later. A request to reopen the trust review. Formal, polite, unforgiving. My mother called within an hour. Hannah, she said, skipping pleasantries. What is this? I sat at my kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the wood. It's the truth, I said. You're blowing this out of proportion, she snapped. We did what was best. For who? There was a pause. Then you're being influenced. Someone's filling your head. I smiled to myself. The old script. If I disagreed, I must be manipulated. No, I said evenly. I'm finally informed. Claire texted me that night, not angry, not apologetic, curious. Why are you doing this now? I stared at the message for a long time before answering. Because you never thought I would. The legal process forced conversations my family had avoided for decades. Depositions were scheduled, financial records subpoenaed. My parents' careful narrative began to unravel thread by thread. They tried to rally allies. Relatives called to check in, their concern thinly veiled. One aunt suggested I was hurting my parents' health. An uncle warned me that money destroyed families. I listened politely, then I kept going. During my mother's deposition, I watched from another room. Video feed muted her posture, rigid. Her answers rehearsed. She spoke confidently about sacrifice, about unity, about how hard parenting had been. Then Marissa asked her about my college fund. The room shifted. My mother hesitated just a fraction too long. Well, she said we had to make choices. Did Hannah agree to those choices, Marissa asked? Silence. And were those funds used exclusively for her education? Another pause, longer. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding. No, my mother admitted they were reallocated. Reallocated. That word echoed in my head for days. Claire's deposition was worse. She tried charm first, then deflection, then tears. When asked whether she believed she'd been treated differently, she said, I didn't ask for it. But you benefited from it, Marissa replied calmly. Claire said nothing. Outside the courtroom, reporters began to circle. A quiet leak about the trust dispute had found its way into business circles. Nothing sensational, just enough to spark curiosity. I kept my head down and let the process work. The night before the preliminary ruling, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of losing, but because winning would mean something final. No more ambiguity. No more wondering if I'd imagined the imbalance. When the judge's decision came through, it was concise, brutal in its clarity. The objections were dismissed. The trust was reinstated. The estate adjusted for growth and mismanagement was transferred to me. My phone lit up like a warning flare. My mother, Claire, numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sat quietly at my desk, hands folded, and let the reality settle. This wasn't just money, it was acknowledgement, written into law. They had erased me on purpose, and the system they'd tried to game had finally corrected itself. But as satisfying as that was, I knew something else now too. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the point where the power finally changed hands. The money didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, transferred through accounts with names that sounded sterile and distant, as if the past were being laundered into something clean. I watched the numbers update on my screen without celebration. No gasp, no tears. Just a long exhale I didn't realize I'd been holding for most of my life. People think money feels like relief. Sometimes it does. But when it comes wrapped in betrayal, it feels more like confirmation. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't dramatic, I wasn't ungrateful. I had been robbed systematically and told to smile while it happened. Within 48 hours of the ruling, my parents' attorney requested a meeting. Neutral ground, mediation, closure. All the words people use when they want forgiveness, without accountability. Marissa asked me what I wanted to do. I want to listen, I said. I don't want to rescue anyone. She nodded. Good, because they're already framing this as a misunderstanding. The meeting took place in a glass conference room overlooking the river. The view was expensive, curated to inspire calm. It didn't work. My mother arrived first, clutching her handbag like a shield. She looked older than I remembered, the lines around her mouth deeper, her confidence brittle. Claire followed a few minutes later, eyes hidden behind sunglasses she didn't remove until she sat down. They both froze when they saw me, not because they were afraid, because they were unsure. They'd never seen me like this before, calm, prepared, unapologetic. "Hannah," my mother said, forcing a smile. "You look well." "So do you," I replied, because politeness was a weapon I'd learned to wield better than either of them. The lawyer began speaking, outlining next steps, emphasizing resolution. I let him talk. When he finished, the room went quiet, the silence pressing in on us like a held breath. Claire broke first. "You didn't have to do it this way," she said. Her voice wasn't angry, it was wounded. "That was new. You could have talked to us." I turned to her. "When?" She frowned. "Any time." "No," I said gently. "Any time you were willing to hear something you didn't already believe." My mother leaned forward. "We made mistakes," she said. "But this is extreme. You've put us in a terrible position." I almost laughed. "A terrible position," I repeated. "You mean exposed." Her jaw tightened. "You're enjoying this." "No," I said. "I'm surviving it." The lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable. I reached into my bag and slid a folder onto the table. Copies of letters, financial statements. That confidential note Eleanor had shown me. "I didn't come here to punish you," I said. "I came here to tell you what happens next." They stared at the folder like it might explode. "I'm not contesting this past anymore," I continued. "The courts handled that. I'm not asking for apologies. I'm not interested in family therapy or public reconciliation." Claire's eyes flicked to my mother. Panic crept in. "What do you want then?" my mother asked. I met her gaze, distance, and honesty. She scoffed. "You're cutting us off." "I'm setting terms," I said. "There's a difference." I laid it out clearly. No financial support for them beyond what the trust legally required. No public statements using my name. No attempts to reframe the story as mutual misunderstanding. Any violation, and I would release the documents publicly. "You wouldn't," Claire said, her voice small. I held her gaze. "I already did." The meeting ended shortly after. There were no hugs, no tears, just two people walking out of a room where their version of reality no longer held. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming outside my windows. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel something close to grief. Not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd never had. A mother who protected me. A sister who saw me as more than competition. A home that didn't require shrinking. Grief doesn't ask permission. It shows up when the threat is gone and your body finally believes it's safe to feel. I slept deeply, dreamlessly. The next morning, the article dropped. A small business journal ran a profile on my work, a quiet mention of the trust dispute buried near the end. No accusations, no names, just facts. Enough for anyone paying attention to connect the dots. My phone stayed silent for 3 days. Then the calls started again, not from my parents, but from people who had known them. Old neighbors, distant relatives, a former colleague of my father's who said I always wondered. The narrative was shifting without me lifting a finger. On the 4th day, I received a message from Claire, not defensive this time, raw. I didn't know it would go this far. I stared at the screen, my chest tight, then I typed back. Neither did I, but it already had. There was no response. Weeks passed. The trust settled fully. My life adjusted around the truth like a river finding a new course. I hired security quietly, changed routines, not out of fear but prudence. People get unpredictable when entitlement collapses. One evening, Marissa called me, her tone curious. "They're struggling," she said. I closed my eyes. Define struggling. "Your parents are downsizing, selling assets. Claire's job offer fell through." I felt nothing, and that more than anything told me how far I'd come. "I don't want updates," I said. "Understood." After I hung up, I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker on one by one. I had spent my entire life believing justice was loud, confrontational, explosive. I was wrong. Real justice was quiet, methodical, final. And the most painful part for them wasn't what I took back. It was what I refused to give them anymore. The strangest part of reclaiming your life isn't the confrontation. It's the quiet afterward. For weeks, nothing happened. No calls, no emails, no dramatic apologies staged for my benefit. My parents obeyed the terms I'd set not because they respected them, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. Fear is a powerful teacher. I'd lived under it my entire childhood. Now it was theirs. I settled into a routine that felt almost foreign in its calm. Mornings without dread, Evenings without bracing myself for criticism that might come from anywhere at any time. I worked, I exercised, I cooked meals I actually tasted instead of swallowing on autopilot. That's when the memories started coming back. Not the loud ones, the small, insidious ones. The afternoon I came home from school with a perfect score on a history exam and found my mother distracted packing for one of Claire's competitions. "That's nice, Hannah," she'd said, already turning away. The night I stayed up sewing my own prom dress because there was no room in the budget, only to watch my sister leave the house in something custom-fitted and breathtaking. At the time, I'd told myself these were inconveniences, normal sibling stuff. You learn to minimize pain when acknowledging it threatens your sense of belonging. Now with distance, the pattern was undeniable. One afternoon, I met my friend Lila for coffee. We'd known each other since graduate school, bonded over shared ambition and mutual exhaustion. She listened quietly as I spoke, stirring her drink slowly. "I always wondered," she said finally. "About what?" "Why you never talked about your family," she said. "Not really. You always redirected, like you were protecting them." I smiled faintly. I thought if I didn't say it out loud, it wouldn't be real. Lila reached across the table and squeezed my hand. It was real anyway. That night I went home and opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Old journals, notes, letters I'd written to myself and never sent. I read through them slowly, seeing my younger self with clarity instead of judgment. She wasn't weak, she was adaptive. An adaptation I realized had been my training ground. A month later, my mother broke the silence. She didn't call. She sent a letter, handwritten. That alone told me it was calculated. She wrote about regret, about sleepless nights, about how she'd done what she thought was best. She wrote about fear, about pressure, about how she hadn't realized the damage until it was too late. What she didn't write was an apology. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't change anything. Accountability without consequence is just storytelling. I didn't respond. That was when the pressure escalated. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years invited me to lunch, then spent the entire meal gently suggesting reconciliation. An old family friend sent me an article about forgiveness. Someone forwarded a sermon clip about honoring your parents. Each attempt came wrapped in concern. Each one ignored the same truth: forgiveness is not a prerequisite for healing. I declined politely, over and over. The more I held my ground, the more frantic the attempts became. Then came the call I hadn't expected. My father. We hadn't spoken directly in years. He'd always let my mother be the voice, the enforcer. His silence had been its own kind of abandonment. "Hannah," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to fix this." I leaned against my kitchen counter, eyes closed. "You don't," I said. He sighed heavily. "Your mother's not well." I felt the old pull immediately. The reflex to sacrifice, to step in, to be the solution. I stopped myself. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "I hope she gets the help she needs." "That's it?" he asked, disbelief creeping in. "Yes," I replied. There was a long pause, then quieter. "You've changed." I smiled. "No," I finally stopped pretending. After the call ended, my hands shook, not from fear, from release. That night I slept deeply again. Weeks later, an opportunity came across my desk that would have thrilled my parents once. A high-profile board position, public visibility, influence. I accepted it without hesitation. The announcement went live the next morning. Congratulations flooded in. My name appeared in places it never had before. And with it, the final shift happened. People stopped asking me about my family. Not because they forgot, because the story had moved on. I'd moved on. One evening, standing in my living room as the city glowed outside, I realized something that startled me with its simplicity. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had carried me through the fight. But peace was what came after. They had taken years from me, confidence, safety, belonging. But they hadn't taken my ability to choose who I became next. And that choice, made daily, quietly, without their permission, was the most powerful revenge of all. The invitation arrived in my inbox on a quiet Tuesday morning, disguised as something harmless. A charity gala, black tie, fundraiser for a historical preservation society in Charleston. The kind of event my parents loved. The kind of room where appearances mattered more than truth. I almost deleted it. Then I saw the host committee list. My mother's name was there, so was Claire's. They hadn't contacted me directly in months, not since my father's call had ended in a silence he clearly hadn't expected. This invitation wasn't reconciliation. It was positioning. A way to be seen near power again. A way to borrow legitimacy. And suddenly I understood the play. They weren't trying to get me back. They were trying to use the idea of me. I accepted the invitation within 5 minutes. Not out of spite, out of curiosity. The night of the gala, I arrived alone. The venue was a restored opera house, all velvet drapes and gold leaf balconies. The kind of place that remembered history selectively. I wore a simple black gown, nothing dramatic, nothing that asked for attention. Confidence doesn't need embellishment. As I stepped inside, the shift was immediate. Conversation stalled, heads turned, whispers rippled outward like a dropped glass shattering in slow motion. They hadn't expected me to come. I spotted my mother across the room, her smile practiced and wide as she spoke to a small cluster of donors. When she saw me, the smile faltered for half a second before snapping back into place. Claire stood beside her posture, rigid eyes scanning the crowd like she was bracing for impact. I didn't approach them, I let the room do the work. Within minutes, people I didn't recognize introduced themselves. Board members, philanthropists, a judge I'd only met once before. Each interaction was polite, warm, effortless. Years of learning how to read a room had paid off. That was when I noticed the change in my mother. She was watching me now, not with anger, with calculation. At some point, she excused herself from her group and crossed the room, intercepting me near the bar. Her perfume hit me before her voice did the same scent she'd worn my entire childhood. Muscle memory is cruel like that. Hannah, she said brightly, as if we were old friends who'd simply lost touch. I'm so glad you came. I was invited, I replied calmly. Her smile tightened. Of course. We just didn't know if you'd be comfortable. I met her gaze. I'm very comfortable. Claire joined us then, her movements sharp, almost defensive. You look nice, she said. It sounded like an obligation. Thank you, I said. So do you. The silence between us stretched thick with things unsaid. Around us, the orchestra began tuning. Glasses clinked. Laughter swelled. Life went on indifferent to our tension. My mother leaned closer. People have been asking about you, she said softly. About how proud we are. There it was. I tilted my head. Are you? Her eyes flickered. Of course. Because you've never said that to me, I replied just as softly. Claire shifted uncomfortably. This isn't the place, she muttered. You're right, I said. This place is for performances. My mother straightened, offense flashing across her face. There's no need to be difficult. I'm not being difficult, I said evenly. I'm being accurate. She opened her mouth to respond, but a voice interrupted us. Hannah Cole. We all turned. A woman in her early 40s stood there, elegant, composed, wearing the expression of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I'm Laura Bennett, she said, extending her hand. I chair the Oversight Committee for the Trust Review. My mother's face drained of color. Claire froze. Laura smiled politely at them both. I wanted to thank you for attending. She continued, her tone neutral. Though I must admit I didn't expect to see you here. My mother swallowed. We're very involved in community causes, she said quickly. Laura nodded. Yes, we've seen the filings. The air changed. I just wanted to tell Hannah, Laura said, turning back to me, that your case has already become a reference point. Not for the money, for the documentation. Documentation, Claire echoed faintly. Laura's smile sharpened. It's rare to see such a clear record of long-term favoritism presented so comprehensively. It's helping us revise oversight guidelines. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. Laura glanced at her, then at Claire. I imagine this must be uncomfortable. Silence. I should let you enjoy the evening, Laura said smoothly, excusing herself. Hannah, we'll be in touch. She walked away, leaving devastation in her wake. For a moment, none of us moved. Then my mother rounded on me, her voice low and furious. Did you plan this? I met her gaze, unflinching. No, I just stopped protecting you. Claire's composure cracked. You're humiliating us, she hissed. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't before. Fear, not of me, of exposure. You humiliated yourselves, I said quietly. I just let people see it. I turned and walked away before either of them could respond. My heart pounded, but my steps were steady. Later that night, as I stood on the balcony overlooking the harbor, the city lights shimmering on the water, I felt something shift again, not anger, not triumph. Closure. They could no longer pretend, not to the world, not to themselves. And for the first time I realized the truth I'd been circling for months. My revenge wasn't taking something from them. It was refusing to carry their secrets anymore. I didn't feel victorious when I left the gala. I felt hollowed out like something old and rotten had finally been scraped clean, leaving raw space behind. The harbor air was cold against my skin as I stood on the balcony, watching the lights ripple across the water. Boats drifted slowly below, unbothered by the quiet implosion happening several floors above them. For years, I'd imagined moments like this ending with a rush of satisfaction, a sense of triumph, maybe even joy. Instead, what settled over me was stillness. The truth had landed, there was no undoing it now. I drove home alone that night, the radio off, my thoughts unusually quiet. For once, my mind wasn't replaying conversations or rehearsing defenses. I wasn't bracing for the next attack. I was simply present. That lasted exactly 3 days. The first sign of fallout came from a place I hadn't expected. My father's brother, Uncle Raymond, called me just after noon on Friday. He'd always been distant but cordial, the kind of man who watched family dynamics like a spectator sport. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. I closed my office door and sat down slowly. "For what?" "For not saying anything," he replied. "I saw more than I admitted. We all did." His honesty surprised me. It also confirmed what I'd long suspected. Silence hadn't been ignorance. It had been choice. "They're unraveling," he added. "Your mother's losing positions, invitations. People are reevaluating." I thanked him and ended the call, my chest tight. Not from guilt, from clarity. That evening, my assistant forwarded me a message marked urgent. It was from a journalist, a national one this time. "They want to do a profile, not on my work, on my family." I stared at the email, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was the point of no return. Up until now, everything had unfolded through official channels, courtrooms, boardrooms, closed doors. This would be public. I called Marissa. She listened carefully, then asked a single question. "Do you want control or do you want silence?" The answer came faster than I expected. Control. We didn't give them everything. We didn't give them emotion. We gave them facts, timelines, documents already on record. We framed it as what it was, a case study in long-term favoritism and its consequences. The article dropped the following week. It didn't vilify my parents. It didn't glorify me. It simply laid out the truth with an elegance that was almost surgical. Quotes from experts. Context. The psychological cost of being the overlooked child. The legal implications of conditional inheritance. My name trended quietly for 2 days. My parents' names did not. That I realized was the real consequence, not scandal, irrelevance. The messages poured in anyway. Strangers. Women mostly. Older than me. Younger than me. All of them telling versions of the same story. I was the quiet one too. My brother always came first. I thought it was just how families worked. I read every message. Not because I needed validation, but because I needed to understand the scope of what had happened to me. This wasn't rare, it was systemic, normalized, invisible. Claire broke her silence 2 weeks later. She showed up at my office unannounced. Security called ahead, unsure. I hesitated, then told them to let her in. She looked different, smaller somehow. Her confidence had always been borrowed, and now it was gone. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, standing just inside the door. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "You could have called." She sat twisting her hands together. "I didn't think you'd answer." "Why are you here?" I asked gently. She swallowed. "Because everything's falling apart." I waited. She took a shaky breath. "Mom's blaming me. Dad's drinking. People won't return my calls. I don't know who I am without all of it. Without the favoritism, without the narrative, without me absorbing the blame. I never asked for it," she said, echoing her deposition words. "But I didn't stop it either." "No," I said. Tears welled in her eyes, real ones this time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I believed her. That didn't change anything. "I hope you figure things out," I said, truly. Her face crumpled. "That's it?" "Yes." She stared at me, disbelief giving way to something like understanding. "You're not going to fix this." "No," I replied. "That was never my job." She left quietly. No scene, no accusations, just a door closing on a chapter neither of us could rewrite. That night, I sat alone in my living room, city lights glowing beyond the windows. I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who'd learned to disappear to survive. She had done her job, but I didn't need her anymore. The truth had burned everything unnecessary away. What remained was solid, unshakable. And for the first time, I felt ready to decide what came next, not in reaction to them, but in service of myself. There's a strange pause that comes after chaos, a moment when the noise fades and you realize nothing is chasing you anymore. That was where I found myself in early spring, sitting at my desk long after everyone else had gone home, the city humming softly outside my window. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting. Not for approval, not for retaliation, not for the next crisis my family would manufacture and drop at my feet. The absence of that constant tension was unsettling at first. I kept bracing for something to go wrong, like someone who's lived near a train track their whole life and still jumps at silence. I filled the space with work. Not the frantic kind, the deliberate kind. Projects I'd postponed because survival had always come first. Long-term planning, mentorship, building something that would outlast headlines. That's when the call came. A woman named Margaret Sloan, a partner at a foundation I'd admired for years, asked if I'd consider serving on their advisory board. "We're starting an initiative for adults estranged from their families," she said. "Specifically those harmed by favoritism, manipulation, or inheritance disputes." I closed my eyes. "That's specific." She laughed softly. "It's overdue." I accepted. Not because it looked good, but because it felt necessary. The first meeting was held in a quiet conference room overlooking the park. Around the table sat people with familiar expressions, polite, guarded, wounded in ways they'd learned to hide. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't give a speech. I told the truth. "I spent most of my life believing the problem was me," I said. Not because anyone said it outright, but because everything was structured to make me feel replaceable. Heads nodded. A few people looked down at their hands. "You don't realize how much energy that belief takes," I continued, "until you stop feeding it." After the meeting, a woman in her 60s approached me. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My sister inherited everything," she said. "I was told I was strong enough to manage without help." I met her eyes. "You shouldn't have had to." She smiled through tears. "Thank you for saying that." I walked home that night lighter than I had in months. A week later, my father emailed me, not called. Emailed. The distance mattered. He wrote about regret, about mistakes, about how he'd failed both his daughters by choosing comfort over courage. It was the closest thing to accountability I'd ever received from him. I didn't reply. Not because I was punishing him, but because I didn't need closure from someone who had spent decades avoiding it. Then came the last thing I'd been subconsciously waiting for. My mother requested a meeting. Not through a lawyer, not through a mediator, through a mutual acquaintance. I considered it carefully, not out of fear, but out of honesty. What did I want from that conversation? The answer surprised me. Nothing. I declined politely. That night I dreamed of my childhood home. Not the way it had been, but empty. Silent. Sunlight pouring through windows that no longer trapped me. When I woke, I understood something essential. Revenge isn't about watching someone fall. It's about no longer orbiting their gravity. My parents' lives were still unraveling in quiet ways. My sister was rebuilding without the scaffolding she'd leaned on her entire life. None of that required my participation anymore. I was busy building a future that didn't need their absence to define it. One afternoon, as I stood in the park watching children play, I noticed how freely they moved, how confidently they claimed space. I wondered who I might have been if I'd learned that earlier. Then I corrected myself. I am who I am because I learned it later. And that knowledge carries weight, depth, choice. I no longer waited for apologies that might never come. I no longer rehearsed conversations I'd never have. I was done waiting. And in that stillness, something unexpected bloomed. Freedom, quiet and unannounced, settling in, like it had always belonged there. The letter arrived on heavy cream paper, the kind that feels deliberate in your hands. Not flashy, not sentimental, intentional. I stood in my kitchen holding it long after I'd read the name printed on the envelope, letting the weight of it sink in. It was from my mother's oldest friend. Not a relative, not an ally, someone who had been close enough to see but far enough to survive it. She was hosting a small Thanksgiving dinner. No speeches, no performances. Just a handful of people who, in her words, understood complicated families. My parents would not be there. Neither would Claire. I didn't answer right away. Thanksgiving had always been dangerous territory for me. Burnt pies blamed on my existence. Conversations that turned sharp the moment I entered the room. Long tables where I learned to take up as little space as possible. But this wasn't an invitation back into the old narrative. It was an invitation out of it. I accepted. The house was modest, warm, filled with the scent of rosemary and butter. When I arrived, shoes were already piled by the door. Laughter drifted from the kitchen. Someone handed me a glass of wine without asking what I preferred, trusting I'd speak up if I wanted something else. That simple assumption caught me off guard. At the table, stories unfolded slowly. Not polished anecdotes meant to impress, but messy truths. A woman who'd been cut out of her family business after a divorce. A man who hadn't spoken to his brother in 20 years after an inheritance dispute. A couple who'd raised children determined to break the cycles they'd grown up in. No one asked me to explain myself. When I did speak, it was because I wanted to, not because silence felt unsafe. Halfway through the meal, the host raised her glass. "To the families we choose," she said simply. The toast landed somewhere deep in my chest. That night, as I drove home through quiet streets, strung with early holiday lights, I realized how much I'd internalized the idea that belonging had to be earned through endurance. That if you stayed long enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, someone would eventually notice. But belonging, I was learning, doesn't come from loyalty to pain. It comes from mutual recognition. December moved quickly after that. Invitations arrived from unexpected places, dinners, small gatherings, not because I was successful, but because I was present, available, whole. Then came the call from the board. They wanted me to chair a new initiative, one focused not on money, but on governance, on accountability in family-owned enterprises, on preventing the kind of quiet harm that never made headlines but ruined lives all the same. "You don't have to accept," Margaret said. "I know," I replied. "That's why I will." The work was demanding, emotionally precise. It required me to look at systems I'd survived and help redesign them without bitterness. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about interruption. During one session, a younger woman stayed behind. She reminded me of myself in ways that made my chest ache. "How did you stop wanting them to see you?" she asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I didn't stop wanting it," I said. "I stopped organizing my life around the hope." She nodded slowly, absorbing it. Later that week, my father sent another email. Shorter this time. Less explanation. More truth. "Your mother is struggling to accept that she can't control the story anymore." I stared at the sentence, then closed the laptop. That wasn't my work. Winter settled in fully. Snow dusted the city. The year drew toward its end, and with it a sense of reckoning I hadn't anticipated, not with them, with myself. One evening, as I decorated my apartment with simple lights and greenery, I caught my reflection in the window. Older than I used to be, softer, stronger. I thought about the girl who used to dread this season, who counted the days until January, as if survival depended on it. This year it didn't. I wasn't waiting to be excluded. I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I was present for my own life, and in that presence something shifted again. Not closure, not forgiveness. Acceptance of what was, of what would never be, of what no longer mattered. As the year came to a close, I understood that the most radical thing I'd done wasn't exposing the truth. It was choosing again and again to build something quieter, sturdier, and entirely my own. The call came 3 days before Christmas, just after dusk, when the city had settled into that soft, deceptive calm that makes everything look kinder than it is. I was standing in my kitchen chopping vegetables for a dinner I was actually looking forward to when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in months. Home. I stared at it until the ringing stopped. Then it rang again. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. That would have been easy. But something in me, steady and grounded now, wanted to know. Not because I felt obligated, but because I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. I answered. "Hannah," my father said. His voice was thin, stripped of the authority it once carried. "Your mother's in the hospital." The knife paused mid-air. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, a familiar tightening in my chest, the old reflex to drop everything and run. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "She collapsed," he said. "They think it's stress-related. The doctors are still running tests." I closed my eyes briefly. Images flashed through me uninvited. My mother in the kitchen, arms crossed, disappointed. My mother at the head of the table, deciding who mattered. My mother nodding in agreement when my sister told me I didn't belong. "I see," I said. There was a pause on the line. "She keeps asking for you." Of course she was. "I'm sorry," I replied. "And I meant it. I hope she recovers quickly." "That's it?" he asked, the disbelief naked now. You're not coming. I leaned against the counter, grounding myself in the cool stone. No, I said, I'm not. You don't understand, he insisted. She's finally realizing how much she hurt you. I almost smiled at that. Almost. She realized she was losing control, I said quietly. That's not the same thing. He exhaled sharply, frustration bleeding through. You're being cruel. No, I said, I'm being consistent. The line went quiet, then softer. We're still your parents. I opened my eyes and looked around my apartment. The soft lights. The table set for people who chose me without condition. The life I'd built deliberately, piece by piece. And I'm still your daughter, I replied. That doesn't mean I owe you access to me. I ended the call gently, without anger, without shaking. My hands were steady. That was how I knew I'd made the right choice. That night I sat with the discomfort. Not guilt, grief. The kind that comes when you finally accept that some relationships will never become what you needed them to be. Christmas arrived quietly. No forced cheer, no bracing. I spent it with friends, laughter, easy conversation, unguarded. We cooked together. We shared stories that didn't require translation or defense. When gifts were exchanged, they were thoughtful, not symbolic. No one was keeping score. In the early afternoon, my phone buzzed once, a text from Claire. She's asking for you again. I stared at the screen, then typed back. I hope she heals. I won't be there. There was no reply. Later, as snow began to fall, I walked alone through the park near my building. Children raced past in scarves too big for them. Couples held hands, breath puffing white in the cold air. I felt a familiar ache, but it didn't hollow me out the way it used to. It passed through me and moved on. I realized then that this was the final test. Not money, not reputation, not public exposure, loyalty. Would I betray myself one last time to soothe someone who had never protected me? The answer was no. A few days later, I received an email from my father, short, unadorned. Your mother is stable. She asked me to tell you she understands now. I read it once, then again. Understanding without accountability is still avoidance. I didn't respond. The year turned quietly. No fireworks, no dramatic closure, just a sense of rightness settling into my bones. For most of my life, loyalty had meant endurance, staying, absorbing harm to keep the peace. Now I understood something different. True loyalty begins with self-respect, and once you learn that, there is no unlearning it. The year ended without ceremony. No countdown, no champagne, no dramatic reconciliation at midnight. Just a quiet snowfall and the steady rhythm of a life that finally belonged to me. That surprised me more than anything. For so long, I'd imagined freedom would feel loud, vindicated, cinematic. Instead, it felt like waking up one morning and realizing your shoulders didn't hurt anymore because you'd stopped carrying something heavy a long time ago. In January, I moved, not far, just enough to mark the shift. A new apartment with wide windows and clean lines, nothing that reminded me of the past. I didn't take much with me. A few books, some photographs. The rest I let go of without nostalgia. People asked if I was running. I wasn't. I was choosing. Work settled into a new rhythm too. Less proving, more building. The governance initiative expanded faster than expected. Family businesses reached out quietly, not wanting headlines, wanting solutions. I sat in rooms where parents listened, really listened, when I spoke about invisible harm. About the child who learns early that love is conditional. About how favoritism corrodes not just families but legacies. Some nodded in recognition, some bristled, some changed. That was enough. In February, I received a final letter from my mother. Not dramatic, not self-pitying, short, careful. She wrote that she was letting go, that she hoped I was well, that she understood now she could not be part of my life unless I invited her. I read it once, then I placed it in a drawer and closed it. Understanding I'd learned didn't require my participation. Spring arrived gently, trees budding, light stretching further into the evenings. I spent more time outside walking without urgency, noticing things I'd rushed past for years. A bookstore I'd never entered. A cafe where the barista remembered my name. Small, ordinary anchors of a life not built around damage control. One afternoon I ran into Claire by chance. On a sidewalk, no warning, no buffer. She looked healthier, less polished, more real. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, two women with a shared history neither of us could rewrite. I'm moving, she said finally. Out west, starting over. I nodded. I hope it works out. She hesitated. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know, I replied. She looked relieved. I just wanted you to know. I see it now. What we did. What I did. I studied her face, searching for old resentment. I found none. Just distance. I believe you, I said. That was all. We parted without promises, without blame, without unfinished sentences chasing us down the street. That night I thought about the idea of karma. People love the word because it suggests balance, a cosmic ledger. But real life doesn't always settle accounts neatly. Sometimes karma isn't punishment, it's revelation. My parents lost control, my sister lost the role she'd been given, and I lost the illusion that I needed any of it to be whole. In April, the foundation hosted its first public forum. Women filled the auditorium, most of them older than me, many of them nodding before I'd finished a sentence. When I spoke, I didn't talk about lawsuits or trusts. I talked about dignity, about the quiet courage it takes to walk away without applause. Afterward, a woman in her 70s approached me. Her hair was white, her posture stooped, but her eyes were sharp. I waited too long, she said. I stayed because I thought it was my duty. I took her hands. You didn't fail, I said. You survived in the only way you knew how. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. I wish I'd heard this sooner. So do I admitted. But regret didn't own me anymore. By summer, my life felt normal. And that I realized was extraordinary. No chaos, no dread, no rehearsed explanations. Just days unfolding with intention. One evening, sitting on my balcony as the city hummed below, I thought back to that night at the wedding. The moment my sister told me no one wanted me there, she had been wrong. What she really meant was that they didn't want a version of me they couldn't control. And I didn't want them either. Revenge had brought me clarity. Truth had brought me justice. But walking away had brought me peace. If you've listened this far, maybe some part of this story felt familiar. Maybe you were the quiet one, the overlooked one. The one told you'd be fine on your own while everyone else was protected. Here's what I learned, and what I want you to hear. You don't need to wait for them to change. You don't need to prove your pain was real. You don't need permission to choose yourself. Sometimes the most powerful payback isn't confrontation. It's building a life so full, so grounded, that their absence no longer feels like a wound. If this story spoke to you, if you've lived some version of it yourself, tell me in the comments. And if you believe that dignity, self-respect, and quiet justice matter like this story, and subscribe for more, because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't being seen by the people who hurt you. It's finally seeing yourself.